Hi, today I'm going to show you how I do my crown bind off for my slouchy hats. This technique I use in my coral reef slouchy hat, which is what I'm currently working on right now. I also use it in my vertical vine slouchy hat, and I find that this decreased crown method that I'm using here helps to create a nice rounded shape and helps the hat just drape really nicely, which is especially important for slouchy hats. So for this technique, if you're following along with one of my patterns, the first step is to E-wrap row 1. You're at the crown bind off section of the pattern. I'm using a 48 peg 5/8 inch gauge nifty knitter loom. These aren't made any longer and are very hard to find. However, Cindy Wood Looms makes the exact same loom, same number of pegs, same gauge, very easy to get, fast shipping. I actually prefer it over the purple nifty knitter. Mine was busy when I started on this hat, so that's why I'm currently using this one right now. So first step is that you're going to for the crown bind off section is just says row 1 EW, which stands for E-wrap. So you're going to go around and you're going to do an E-wrap knit stitch around every single peg and bringing the bottom up over the top. You want to do this all the way around the loom, and then your last peg, your last stitch for row 1 will be on 48, on peg 48, and I will join you back up when I've completed my row of E-wrap. So here I am, I'm at the last peg. I've done an E-wrap stitch, I'm bringing the bottom over the top, and now we're ready to start the second row of the crown bind off method that I use for slouchy hats. The pattern, if you're following along, will say row 2, and I'll have an asterisk, and I'll say EW2, which stands for E-wrap 2, K2 tog, which stands for knit 2 together, and then skip SK1, which stands for skip. Sometimes people also refer to this as slip. And then there's an asterisk following it, stating for you to repeat the sequence that's in the asterisk around the loom to complete the row. So I'm going to show you how this starts. So the first part of the sequence in the stars is to E-wrap 2. So you E-wrap 1, E-wrap 2. Then it says comma, K2 tog, or knit 2 together. And to knit 2 together, you're bringing the stitch on peg 4 to peg 3. And if you want, you can mark. Sometimes people find it helpful to mark stitches or mark their pegs certain ways. And then you're going to E-wrap this. We're doing all E-wrap stitches for the body and crown portion of this pattern. So we're going to E-wrap that peg that now has 2 loops on it, and we're going to bring both bottom loops up over the top one. Now the last part of this sequence is to skip 1. So all that means is you don't work this peg. You just take your working yarn and you run it behind the loom, and that's the end of the the asterisk sequence. So now you're ready to start over again with the E-wrap 2, and then knit 2 together. You're bringing the peg over from the 4th in the sequence to the 3rd, wrapping it with an E-wrap stitch, bringing both bottom stitches over the top one, skipping the 4th peg in this sequence. So that's completed that section, the EW2, K2 tog, SK1, and you keep repeating that. E-wrapping 2, knitting 2 together, bringing the 4th peg in the sequence over to the 3rd in the sequence, E-wrapping that, and the stitch that's left empty when you move over, we're just skipping and we're running our working yarn behind and starting over with the next sequence. We're doing an E-wrap 2, and then a knit 2 together. Now the opposite of a knit 2 together is what is called a slip knit, or an SSK. And so if the pattern said to knit 2 or E-wrap 2 and then SSK or slip knit, you'd be moving the peg, instead of 4 to 3, you'd be moving it from 3 to 4. However, we're not using that in this, but I'm just wanting to point out that that is the reverse mirror image of the knit 2 together. So then again, we bring the 4th peg in the sequence over to the 3rd, wrap over, bring both loops that are on the bottom up over the top, and skip the next peg. And you keep repeating this sequence around, and as you can see, your loom will look like this, where there are 3 pegs and then an empty peg, 3 pegs with stitches, and then a peg with that's empty, 3 pegs, and then an empty stitch. And this will result in leaving you with 36 pegs wrapped. I'm going to complete the row. I'll come back and show you one more time before I finish the row how I'm finishing. Okay, we're now at the end of the row of row 2 for the crown bind off, and you're E-wrapping the last 2 pegs in the row, followed by a knit 2 together where you're moving the peg that's 4th in the sequence over to the 3rd and knitting those together and skipping the last peg, just not working that peg in the loom, on the loom. You're now ready to start row 3 of the crown bind off, which is to simply E-wrap all the remaining pegs that are left on the loom, skipping any of the empty pegs. So your working yarn, you're going to want to bring from behind, skip any empty pegs, E-wrap. There'll be 3 pegs at a time. So I'm E-wrapping peg 1, 2, and 3. And then I'm skipping the empty peg that does not have a stitch on it and E-wrapping the next 3 that do have stitches on them. And you go around E-wrapping each of those pegs that still have stitches on them and skipping the empty peg. As you can see, you're going to have 3 stitches, 3 pegs with stitches on them, and then an empty one, 3 stitches and an empty one, and those are the ones that you're E-wrapping and knitting over. The empty pegs, you're just running your working yarn behind and pretending like it doesn't even exist. So I'm going to go ahead and complete that row, and then I'll show you the next row for this bind off. So here I am ending the row. There is the last 4 pegs. The last one does not have a stitch on it. I've E-wrapped this 4th to the last peg, which would be 48, 47, 40, excuse me, it's been a long day. Anyways, you're knitting those over and you're skipping this last peg in the row, peg 48 in this case. And now you're ready to begin on row 4. And for row 4, it is a repeat of an SSK, which stands for slip, slip, knit, which, as I mentioned before, is the opposite of a knit 2 together. And then we're going to skip 1 and E-wrap 1. So to slip, slip, knit, and before when we were doing the knit 2 together, we were bringing the peg that was on, 4 to 3 or 3 to 2. This time, in this case, we were doing 4 to 3. This time, since it calls to slip, slip, knit, we're going to, for the first row, in every row we're always starting off on peg 1, we're going to take the stitch that's on peg 1, move it to the top of peg 2. You're going to skip 1. This is the one, the peg 1 is the one that the pattern is calling for you to skip. And then you're going to knit those together. The stitches on peg 2. And then the pattern states to E-wrap 1. It says comma EW. And this is my pattern that I'm following along with, so this should help you understand how I write patterns better as well. And then you continue repeating this sequence in skipping the looms, skipping the pegs that had been skipped before the previous row. So we're going to skip this peg, we're going to slip, slip, knit, we have an empty peg on 1, we have stitches on 2, 3, we have an empty peg on 4, we're not doing anything to that stitch, we're moving peg 5 over to peg 6, carrying our working yarn behind these 2 pegs, and then E-wrapping both of those pegs, bringing your bottom stitches over, both stitches over to the top. Again, we're not doing anything with the pegs that have been emptied. The sequence that's to be repeated, the SSK or slip, slip, knit, we're moving this on the pair of 3s where the stitches remain. We're going to always move the peg on the first set of 3 to the second set of 3, carrying our working yarn behind the 2 empty pegs that are created, E-wrapping both pegs, and I'll show you one more time, and then I'll show you again when we get to the end of the row. So we're skipping the pegs that have been emptied before. We have pegs all the way around with 3 stitches on them. We're moving the first stitch in the 3 peg sequence over to the second peg. We're then doing an E-wrap on both of those pegs. Pegs that have 2 loops on them, we bring both over. And if you find that it's hard to bring over, you can bring one over at a time. So that is row 4 for the decrease bind off. I'm going to go ahead and complete moving the first peg in each 3 over to the second, knitting those together, E-wrapping and knitting the third peg and skipping. And you'll end up with your loom having an empty peg 1, and then there'll be 2 stitches that remain on pegs 2, 3, and every 2 pegs will be empty, every 2 pegs will have a knit stitch, but peg 1 should be empty. And now at the end of the row for row 5, I'm knitting the last 2 pegs using the E-wrap or twisted stockinette stitch. And now we're ready to bind off of the hat. For this bind off, it's just really a drawstring bind off, gathered bind off. What I like to do is wrap the yarn, if I have a lot extra, wrap the yarn all the way around the loom, about 2.5 times, so that I make sure that I have enough yarn remaining to do the bind off. So here I've come around once, I've come around twice, and now here I am at about 2.5. And so I'm going to cut my working yarn. And this just makes it a little bit easier to bind off. There's not as much of a working yarn tail. And then you simply do a drawstring cast off, but you're skipping any of the empty pegs. And you're only bringing your working yarn from the bottom, just like you'd be purling the peg, but instead of removing the stitch, you pull the peg all the way through, or the working yarn through, yarn tail. So it goes up through, and then you pull, and you'll see your yarn tail. You want to leave all the stitches on, and you continue skipping the empty pegs, bringing your yarn tail or your working yarn up through, keeping the stitch that was on the peg on, and pulling your yarn through. And you do that to each and every peg. As you go around, keeping them still on the loom, because once we've gone all the way around, we're going to want to go back and run our yarn back through the first peg that we started with. So I'm just going to continue on. And then I will join up with you and show you when I've completed the row how we remove it from the loom and weave in the tail ends. Okay, so I'm back at the end of the row. I'm pulling my yarn tail through the bottom and top. And as you can see, I continued just skipping the empty pegs. Your loom should look like this. Granted, it'll vary on the hat pattern you're using and which row you've left off as to whether your hat looks like that. But so I'm pulling it through, and now I want to bring it back through the first peg that we pulled our yarn tail through once more. So in this case, this would be peg 2. And now all you simply do is you can use your fingers or your loom hook and go around and remove each stitch that is on the loom. And like I said, there should be, in this case, 24 stitches remaining. Your loom's been divided by half. And you can now my yarn's stuck. Remove your loom and simply take your hat, turn it inside out, bring your yarn tail back, and now you're just going to drawstring close the hat shut. Pulling snugly. And then what I do is, since there's so much extra yarn, I probably leave more yarn than actually is needed. I'm going to cut the working yarn so that there's just enough for me to weave in and secure. I'm going to cut it so that there's maybe about, 6-7 inches, give or take. Then you take a tapestry needle, yarn needle, thread your tail end through. Make sure that your stitches are all snug. Pull on it. And then I simply weave it through the hat and the inside of the hat, and I kind of go around the top of the hat brim. It's kind of hard to see probably with this. Once I've gone around a few times, I simply then just take my yarn and I kind of just thread it through one of the stitches from where we wrapped around as we were going, bringing it up and through, and then securing it by pulling tight. I'm kind of extra paranoid, so sometimes I'll go back and then again do the same thing so that it kind of makes like a crisscross on the top. And I leave this loop that's here, and I bring my needle and my yarn through, making sure that the tail end isn't caught, and secure it. Now this is, remember, the inside of the hat, and then where I've secured it, I just trim the yarn close. You can always go in and even trim it up a little bit better. And now you could flip your hat inside out. And your bind off is complete. Thanks for joining me. I hope this was a help. Have a great day.